It's great to be here and extraordinary to be here, really, on behalf of Go Gentle, because what we're going to do today, I'm going to take you through some of the story and some of the story of Go Gentle and bring you up to speed on what's happening around Australia. Then we're going to have a panel conversation with some people who are going to give you a deeper understanding about what's at stake and what these laws could be. And then we're going to hear from the indefatigable Sue Shearer about how you can get involved. We expect you to get involved, and that's why we're locking the doors right now. So let's get started with this man who many of you may recognise, your former Chief Minister, Marshal Perron. And it really is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable stories of political change anywhere in the world. Because in 1994, sitting by a swimming pool in Phuket in Thailand, this man read a report by a woman called Helga Kusa, a philosopher and bioethicist, which argued for voluntary euthanasia. It said that if you're at the end of your life, you should have a right to what Marshall calls the keys to the medicine cabinet to end your suffering. And Marshall read this, and he turned to his wife, Cherry, and he said, I can make this happen. I can win this argument. I'm going to put forward a bill. Now, you've got to understand that no one anywhere in the world had put forward this legislation. So here was your Chief Minister deciding to do it here in the Northern Territory. And yes, he did put forward a bill. And you know, it's very easy for us to dismiss our politicians as cynical creatures. Well, if you want to talk about an act of principle, Marshall's view on this was that this was not a political issue. This was a human rights issue. But of course it was political. He was the Chief Minister. So before the debate started in 1995, he resigned as Chief Minister so he wouldn't unfairly influence or be seen to unfairly influence the debate from his position of power. So your parliamentary debate happened, and the third reading it passed by just one vote. And it's interesting to note that one of those votes was the member for Arnhem, Wes Lanenpoy, who had a 73% Aboriginal constituency in his electorate and was himself Aboriginal. And it is often cited, and I'm sure you've heard it cited in this conversation, that Aboriginal Territorians are deeply opposed to this. Well, there you go. One of those key votes that made this a law was from the member for Arnhem. So the law passed in July 1996. It became a law. And I think it's fair to say at that point, all hell broke loose. No, actually, perhaps more correctly, all heaven broke loose. Because the church, in particular the Catholic Church, and their many surrogates in the medical profession, and the many surrogates in parliaments around Australia, went to work. And you had church leaders standing up in front of the media in Darwin saying this is outrageous. You had the then head of the AMA standing on the steps of Parliament House speaking into the cameras of the media and saying to doctors, any doctor that gets involved in this may well be prosecuted and is likely to be prosecuted, warning everybody off. You had challenges to the Northern Territory Supreme Court, to the Federal Supreme Court, an appeal to the then federal government, all wishing to overturn this law, all rejected, until eventually in August 1996, a little-known Liberal federal backbencher called Kevin Andrews put forward, steady on, it's too early to boo, we haven't got to the booing bit yet. He put forward the Euthanasia Repeal Bill in federal parliament. In the meantime, this man, Bob Dent, came forward. That's Bob with his wife, Judy. I don't think Judy's here this evening, but hopefully she'll join us tomorrow. And Bob was a former pilot and a robust man who had metastatic prostate cancer. He was 66 and his life had become absolutely miserable. He'd had his testicles removed. He was under constant care. He could do nothing for himself. His bones had become so brittle that even a hug threatened to break his ribs. He was on a roller coaster of pain. He was incontinent. He had to sleep on rubber sheets. His life was a constant parade of misery. And in September 1996, almost a little over 30 years ago last week, 29 years ago last week, Bob became the first person in the world to be assisted to die legally. Dr. Philip Nitschke did that, and it was an extraordinary moment because no one had ever done it before. Dr. Nitschke had created a machine which a cannula was put into Bob's arm, and there were a series of commands that only Bob could agree to, which would eventually release the lethal liquid into his arm and end his life. And Bob's death, the first man ever in the world to be legally assisted to die, was news around the world. And you may, if there's one podcast you might like to listen to called BBC Eyewitness, which records moments in history from around the world from their own archives, you may want to go and listen to the episode about Bob's death. It was a huge thing. 3 more people used that law, the ROTI law, the Right to the Terminally Ill Act. It passed the Senate by only 5 votes. I'd like to place on the record, by the way, that one of the MPs in the lower house that spoke against the repeal of the law was our current Prime Minister. I think that's worth noting. And the debate itself set the tone for a lot of what was to come, because the oft-used phrase in response to this law was that it was state-sanctioned murder. And if you go back through the Hansard, I found this quote from the member for Wakefield in South Australia, that part of what gives life its meaning is the grim reality of suffering. Now, the reason I mention that is because over coming years, as attempts to pass a similar law were defeated, this argument, which comes directly from a faith-based perspective, that suffering at the end of life is something to be valued and is a tribute to God, not only had a powerful impact in parliaments, but was powerfully reflective of a number of people in our medical profession. So, let's skip forward. Exactly 3 weeks after the repeal of the ROTI law, my dad, Kit, passed away in Katoomba in New South Wales. Kit always used to joke, he was a pretty funny man, he used to joke that the way he wanted to die was to walk into a swimming pool filled with single malt whiskey and just keep walking. That's not what happened. Dad had, amongst other things, congestive heart failure. He was in our local hospital. They did the very best they could. They gave him all the morphine they had to hand, etc., all the stuff. And it didn't work. And his last 3 days were profoundly shocking to witness. And his suffering and our suffering remain today. And it was so traumatizing that we never spoke about it as a family, not for many years, because we didn't know, who do you talk to? You're in a hospital system. They're doing their best. We assume they're the experts. We assume that's how it goes. There's no one to talk to about it. So, about 15 years later, when I had moved on from my work in the media, you may remember me as formerly Australia's top model, I had time and space, and I was challenged to give a talk about a controversial subject. And I just said, I want to talk about euthanasia. And I said, I don't want to just rock up and give a talk. I'll do it next year. And so I set off to find out more about the subject. Little did I know that 10 years later, I would be standing here, having established a national charity, Go Gentle, after 7 grueling campaigns to see this law happen around Australia. And I'll tell you why. Because as I travelled around for that year, not just overseas, but around Australia, talking to people on all sides of this argument, I was very lucky. I got to start my journey at the one and only international anti-euthanasia convention ever held in the Southern Hemisphere, right here in Adelaide. And I sat there right through it, spoke to everyone, took notes, and that was my guide. Whatever you're arguing, let's see what the truth is. But as I travelled around Australia, what I discovered was these horrendous stories of how people were dying and suffering at the end of their lives. Inexcusable deaths. Deaths happening in hospitals, in palliative care wards, sometimes in people's homes. What I found was, shockingly, that there were doctors, and often senior doctors, and almost always, when you scratch the surface, doctors of faith, who were suggesting that these deaths either weren't happening, or if more money was thrown at palliative care, they could be fixed, or that these stories were exaggerated, or just sweeping them under the carpet. I thought then, and I think now, that this was as big a scandal as the child abuse scandals that happened in Australia. And I can assure you, had there been a royal commission at any time into what happens to Australians at the end of life, people in this country would have been deeply revulsed, and these laws would have been passed a decade ago. But there never was that royal commission. And what I discovered most of all, and most shockingly of all, and this, by the way, had the biggest impact in parliaments around Australia, were the suicides of people who were terminally ill. I mentioned Marshall before. Marshall, for years, followed up this. He knew too many stories. And between us, we did a lot of research. There's a thing called the National Coronial Information Service. And it took a lot of digging. But it turned out the statistics were that every week in Australia, 2 people over the age of 80 were taking their own lives. And more than a quarter of those people were doing so by hanging. None of those deaths were excusable. And these were people who were terminally ill and were suffering. So I realised that there was a very dark thing happening in this country, which was not only not being addressed, it was being denied by people that knew better. And here's what else I learned as I travelled around Australia, that the fight to pass these laws was completely uneven. Since Roti was overturned from when I got involved in 1915, World War I, 2015, there had been something like 50 attempts in different parliaments to pass this law, 13 in South Australia alone. None of them had got anywhere. Most of them hadn't even got to a second reading. They were just dismissed out of hand. And I realised that's because it was a totally unfair fight. On the one hand, fighting for these laws, you had some of the most vulnerable people in Australia. You had people who were terminally ill. You had families who were traumatised by what they'd witnessed. You had remarkable community groups, which still exist today, the Dying with Dignity groups, the Northern Territory Voluntary Euthanasia Society, who were doing incredible work, but who had no resources, very little money, no modern communication skills, no PR firms, none of that stuff. And against them, you had the biggest and most powerful interest groups in Australia. You had first and foremost and always behind it all, the Catholic Church. You had the Church of England. You had every medical body in Australia from the AMA and palliative care on, bar one. There was one medical body in this country that thought we should have a law for assisted dying. And guess who that was? The nurses. Yes. Because they're the ones that are hearing the cries for help. And they're the ones that were listening to and trying to tend to the suffering. They were the ones who, as one senior nurse said to me in New South Wales, would go into the linen closet and just cry because they knew there was nothing they could do. But everybody else was stacked against. And so at parliamentary inquiries, whenever this came up, senior doctors and all these medical bodies would step forward and MPs would just go, well, the medical profession doesn't think this is a good idea, so of course we're not going to rock the boat. So that's why I decided to set up Go Gentle. I had time, I had connections, I was massively wealthy due to my time at the ABC. I had a stretch limo made out of Lego, let's be honest. And I had spent a year looking at what had been going on. So I had, I guess, an unparalleled view as to what had worked and what hadn't worked. And also, magnificently, when I went to the Anti-Euthanasia Convention, and I did go there openly, I said, I think there should be a law. Wonderfully, they told me all their strategies for how they'd stopped these laws in the past. So I was heavily armed. And I launched Go Gentle at the National Press Club in 2016. And when I did so, I launched this book, The Damage Done, which might be the fastest book ever pulled together in the history of Australian publishing. A small group of us pulled this entire book together from beginning to end in about 5 weeks. And it's a collection of testimonies which one journalist described as not unputdownable, but unpickupable, because it's a collection of testimonies from families and doctors and nurses about how people were dying in this country. And on the back of it is a quote from the Victorian coroner, John Olley, whose evidence to the Victorian Parliament profoundly affected their debate about the suicides of the terminally ill, including one man with prostate cancer who used a nail gun. And this was John's quote: "There is a cry for help. It may be muted, it may be veiled, but it is there nonetheless, and they all know it, including doctors. They know that this person is screaming for help, but no one is going to answer this call, not in this society, so they've got to die alone." John Olley, when he gave his testimony, by the way, remember this is the state's coroner, wept. So, what did I learn from all those years of campaigning about what works? First of all, and Sue's already hinted at this, what makes change? Yes, politicians of principle and health professionals of courage and institutions like the Nurses Federation stepping up. But what really makes change is the community. I think it is accurate to say that there has been no greater example of community-created laws in contemporary Australian political history than the VAD laws. This is the steps of the South Australian Parliament. Over the last 7 or 8 years, I saw people, some of whom were dying, step forward, bear witness, speak to committees, be heard, be heard, be heard, be heard, be heard. They refused not to be heard. And it was this overwhelming evidence that made the arguments against start to crumble, because it was clear that there was a significant public health issue in this country. I learnt that to win this battle, you have to build networks. You have to find all those people that agree with you and start to work together. If one medical organisation is against you, that doesn't mean all their members are. You have to find the ones who are. You have to make sure that every no is countered by a yes, so the politicians can no longer go, oh, they all don't agree. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of legwork. I found that you've got to spend time speaking with your opponents and respectfully, and those that doubt or those that are fearful, and hear what their doubts and fears are and work out how to address them. Do your research. Never assume that particularly an MP, if they oppose this, is doing it reflexively. Sometimes it's something in their family history. Sometimes it's something they don't understand. The most fruitful conversations I had were with the people who strongly disagreed with me. I learned that you had to be realistic about what your goals were. There was no point arguing in Australia with our Judeo-Christian, mostly conservative parliaments for a liberal European law which came from a completely different political philosophy. And that's why you have to do your research. You have to know what the people who are going to vote for this legislation, what it is they're worried about, what it is they're prepared to support. If you are putting forward legislation to an MP that they can't go home and explain to someone in their local pub, then you've got a problem. You've got a political problem. And I saw this play out in the first campaign we ever did in South Australia, where it failed by one vote at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's a whole other story. And I learned one other thing, and this is the key thing, and this is the thing I most want everyone to take away today. You've got to be relentless. This is just a little bit of the media that we garnered in Western Australia over 7 or 8 months. Your opponents, the Australian Christian lobby, etc., they'll be relentless. They will be spreading misinformation at every turn, wherever they can. Our internal motto was this: no stone unturned, no turd unstoned. Whenever we heard a piece of misinformation, a lie, a piece of bullshit, we were there. There was a local paper, the national newspaper, parliamentary inquiries. We wrote rebuttals to arguments which were 60 or 70 pages long, specifically for MPs, so they would be armed. You have to be relentless if you want to get change. So, let me skip forward. I was going to tell you the story of Kerry Robertson, the first person to use this law, the new law in Australia and Victoria. Well, I will tell you briefly. Kerry was 61 and light bulb dead, metastatic cancer, started in her breast, had gone to her brain, to her lungs, to her bones. and her life was miserable like Bob's. But unlike the controversy and difficulty that surrounded Bob's death, Kerry was legally assisted to die. Her daughters Jackie and Nicole were with her. David Bowie was playing in the background. They were stroking her. They were telling her how much they loved her. And they said, as so many others have said, how beautiful it was. So what's the situation in Australia today? Well, as you can see, everywhere in Australia has this law. There's probably one gap. I'm not quite sure what it is. Maybe you can spot it. The law basically, in essence, it's for adults over the age of 18 who are mentally competent, who are terminally ill, who are suffering unbearably, who, in the opinion of two doctors who assess them, have an illness or medical condition or disease which is likely to cause their death within 6 or 12 months. It can vary between states. They have to be citizens of Australia or permanent residents. They must demonstrate their mental competency throughout the application process, which can take 3 to 4 weeks and involves multiple assessments and multiple times where you have to assert your competency and that this is your wish, that you are not being coerced. That is essentially the Australian model. Since 2019, when Kerry Robertson was the first person to use this law, roughly 8,000 Australians have applied for assisted dying. But slightly less than half have actually ended up using that medication. Now, some die because they come to the process too late. That's a whole other issue. Some die because they make another choice. They have the medication, but they don't want to use it. They use palliative care. Having it there is palliation, the confidence that they can be in control if the worst could happen. What else we've learned is that these laws are operating safely. You know, the average age of people using them is 74, slightly more men than women. The vast majority of people, 80%, are dying of cancer. None of this is a surprise. This is what happens overseas, where these laws pre-existed Australia's. We know that these laws are working safely and as intended. We know that the things that were always raised as the arguments against, that people would be coerced to die, there is no evidence of that. What there is, a disturbing amount of evidence of coercion against these laws, often from families, but also from health professionals. The many ways in which people are discouraged or outright stopped from asserting their legal rights. That's a big challenge that we're still dealing with. We've learnt that the argument that this will be bad for palliative care is completely untrue. In fact, the opposite is the case. 80% of people who use VAD are also in palliative care. The palliative care numbers in states where this law has come into existence have gone up because more people have become aware of it as an option. We've learned that the fear that this would somehow damage the doctor-patient relationship is not only untrue, but the exact opposite has happened. We hear profound and consistent testimonies from families that have been through this of their gratitude to the health professionals who've helped them, the angels that they are. And equally, we hear profound and sincere testimonies from health professionals about how helping people in this way has been the most educative and remarkable thing they've done in their careers. And for many doctors, it's changed the way they approach their practice and how they assess patients generally. And we've learnt that to do this, to choose to end your life, to go through the process, to tell yourself, to tell your family, to tell your doctor that this is what I want to do, and then to pick that day to say goodbye to everything you know and love, takes immense courage and determination. And that, if you hear people talking about safeguards, it's not written into any law, that is the number one safeguard. This is a hard thing to do, and the respect I have for the people I've spoken to that have gone through it, or the people I know who have gone through it, is immense. And speaking personally, if I was seriously ill and had that medication, I'm not sure that I could do it. Like most Australians, I want to die being hit by a meteor while having sex. Probably not going to happen. So, here's an interesting statistic. Two, actually. First of all, less than a decade from when these laws were first passed, what was a deeply opposed, highly controversial medical option deeply opposed within the medical community, is now largely mainstream. And there is not a single medical body in this country that opposes VAD. That's a big shift. And here's the second statistic. Those 4 people here in the Northern Territory that used that law back in 1996, they were the first 4 in the world, the only 4 that had that choice. Today, in more than 14 countries, 300 million people have that choice, including every Australian other than you. So, what do? Why are we here? That's a picture I took of Marshall Perron and his wife Cherry with his hotted up car in Queensland a couple of years ago. On the way here this morning, Marshall rang me, and Marshall is an example of what you need to do. Sue Shearer is an example of what you need to do. Judy Dent, who for almost 30 years has been heading the Northern Territory Voluntary Euthanasia Society, is an example of what we need you to do, which is you need to be organised. You need to do your research. You need to be respectful, and you need to be relentless. If you want this law to happen, and we might talk a little bit about the politics of that in the next little section, if you want this law to happen, you need to be heard, and you need to get your friends to be heard, and you need to get, if you're, next time you see your doctor, say, what do you think about this? Get your doctor to contact their MP. I used to work with a man called Neil Lawrence, who sadly died unexpectedly. And Neil Lawrence was the architect of the famous Kevin 07 campaign, so considered one of the best political campaigning minds in the country. And he had a very simple maxim. It's not what politicians think. It's what they think everyone else thinks. And he was right, and he's still right. That's why Linda and I are here today. We want to not just encourage you, as I imagine many of you already do, to support this issue, but you need to get active. The second report will be released, I think, in the next couple of weeks. There are many ways in which a government can, even if a report recommends a law as the first one did, can make legislation slow down, disappear, get lost in the wheels of parliamentary process. What will change that is if they start to think that there's going to be cost. And what's cost? It's getting the people who vote for them to tell them, you're wrong, we need change, we want change. And so what I hope will happen here is what happened in other states. There'll be coalitions going to step forward. No one individually. There'll be doctors. There'll be medical bodies. There'll be families who are going through hell right now. There'll be families who've been through hell. There'll be nurses. There'll be all sorts of people. There may even be, you'd be surprised, some people of religious background, even priests, that step forward and say, no, this is a good thing. You never know who your allies are. So I encourage you to act relentlessly, respectfully, and with careful research. And let's go forward and get this done. It's past time, well past time. What we're going to do now is take a little break, just while we reset the panel here, and then we're going to meet some locals, and we're going to talk to them about what they've been through and what they've learnt. And then we're going to take some questions from you, and then Sue's going to talk to you about some specific things you can do to get involved. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. It's like a magic show. You never saw anything happen. And I'd like to introduce, please, our panel, and I'll get them to quickly tell you about themselves. To my far right, Gavin Perry.
Hello.
We'll come back to you in a minute. In the middle, Duncan McConnell, SC.
Hello.
Charging by the minute? I hope not. And to my right, Kelly Bayliss. Welcome them all, please.
Hi.
So, Gavin, I'll start with you. Can you give me a 30-second autobiography of your actually pretty interesting story? I know you've lived in the Territory 52 years?
Yes, I've been here 52 years. Loved every minute of it. I've been diagnosed with cancer recently, but I also gave an interview to the NT News when I found that the law that was Justine Davis was trying to introduce into Parliament wasn't going to go anywhere, so I decided to speak out. I'm not used to speaking in public, but anyway, the time was right. I remember 30 years ago the law being debated in Parliament with Barry Coulter. I presume you were there. Everybody talked. 25 members of Parliament stood up and talked all night. I was listening on the radio. I was very impressed by people speaking from the heart about a subject that was so foreign to me and to most people, talking about voluntary assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia. Anyway, I was very impressed by it. The Territory in those days seemed to be a place where anything could happen. It was an amazingly progressive society, really. And it's very sad that it all ended so badly. I felt very disappointed about it all. But anyway, that's enough.
That's a good start, Gavin. We're going to come back to you in a minute. By the way, I'm going to throw the floor open to Barry Coulter a bit later, your former Deputy Chief Minister, because he was in the middle of all of the technical term is that shit fight. Duncan, just if you could quickly introduce yourself.
Duncan McConnell. I'm a long-term Territorian. I was born just over the border in Western Australia. Grew up in Katherine and went to the Pauling Finishing School in Darwin in the late 1980s. I've worked as a lawyer in the top end for 30-something years. My mother passed away from metastatic lung cancer about 8 years ago. I was up close watching her go through the last stages of her life. I was profoundly affected by that, but not in a way that made me want to campaign for euthanasia laws. But it was a realisation, I think, that that we didn't have that right here, and we were seeing that right come into law in Australia, and it seemed the natural course to follow for the Northern Territory to have that law restored. And as a lawyer, I was personally affronted that the Commonwealth could take away our right to self-government in the way that they had done. So when I was given the chance to co-chair the first expert panel that considered voluntary euthanasia laws for the Northern Territory, I was excited and honoured to be part of that process. And I have to say, it was a profound experience for me personally to go around throughout the Territory. We didn't just go up and down the track. We went throughout the Territory. We spoke to people from all walks of life. There was widespread, strong support for voluntary euthanasia laws in the Northern Territory. We were tasked with considering applying to the Northern Territory experience, which is different to the rest of Australia, and giving advice to government about what would need to happen here to make it viable, to make it safe, to make it work in the Northern Territory, and I felt that we did that.
I'll come back with some questions about that. Kelly, thank you very much. And I know you're here with the Mast Bayliss family. There's about 49 of them over there. Tell us a bit about yourself, Kelly.
Hi, I'm Kelly Bayliss. I'm the daughter of John Bayliss, and as Andrew said, very big family, 7 brothers, 2 sisters, and lots of nieces, nephews, and lots of extended family as well. I'm here to talk about the perspective of us as children watching our dad go through a horrible case of motor neuron disease. Dad was a really strong advocate for voluntary assisted dying. He was very, very outspoken in his cause, and it reflected in his Facebook page. If anyone has ever read any of his stuff, it's pretty strong stuff. But for us, I think we're here more to talk about the experience of watching him go through something that he really wanted to go through. Not necessarily us as the children, because it was still relatively new and it was quite raw, wanting to support your dad to let him go. But I think 10 years of reflection and, sort of turning it over and discussion between ourselves, it is something that's definitely needed, and it's something he wanted, and I think everybody should have a choice.
Thank you, Kelly. Gavin, I might come back to you. You said you've got cancer. It's cancer of the eye, is that right?
Yes, I was. I suddenly woke up one morning blind in one eye from a detached retina. For anybody who's had a detached retina, it's quite frightening because the lights come on and they start swirling around, and there's all sorts of chaos. There's what I was calling what are those things called when the children used to play with them? Well, it was like that. But I had, flashing lights, all sorts of problems. I couldn't see properly. I had to go down to Adelaide for treatment because they don't do detached retinas up here. So, thank you. So when I went to Adelaide for a detached retina, they discovered a tumour in my eye. Melanoma in the eye is not a good thing. I had to go back to Adelaide 4 times in the last 5 months to have surgery, which is radiation. It's called brachytherapy. They cut your eye open, basically, and stick in radiation pellets into your eye, sew them onto the eyeball, and then, I don't know, a week later, they take it out. But mine went a bit wrong anyway, and I had a heart attack. That's another story. I survived all that. And each time I had to come back to Darwin, I had to wait a month and then go back to Adelaide. It was, I discovered then that I didn't really want to be treated in Adelaide. I was much happier. I miss my home a lot. I miss my garden. I miss my friends. I missed everything. I missed Darwin. I didn't want to be in Adelaide. So when the treatment was finally finished, that was great. Except that when I went to see the oncologist recently in Darwin, they're now looking at me in the Darwin hospital, but they've said that the melanoma is still there. They've killed the tumour in my eye, but the melanoma won't go away. It'll metastasize. They took a biopsy, and all the genomics show that what it's going to do. They know pretty well what happens with ocular cancer. Ocular melanoma remains ocular melanoma wherever it metastasizes to. So it'll go to my liver, they expect, but it still remains eye cancer in my liver. It's not treatable in Darwin. I'll have to go back to Adelaide for immunotherapy, and they've told me pretty much what's going to happen. I'm not very happy about it because I don't want to go off for treatment in Adelaide all the time. And I want to be at home. I want to be with my friends, my family, my house, my garden, everything that I love, all my quality of life is here. So to be told that I might get, I most likely will get sick with, chemotherapy in Adelaide, it's a dreadful situation. I mean, we're at a disadvantage living in Darwin because we don't have the treatment that we could have. It's just not possible. So I have a choice to make about whether to continue treatment. I'm not ill yet. I'm well. I'm happy. I'm in Darwin. I love it here. I'm just being given all this prognosis really last week by the oncologist. So my trauma still goes on that I don't know what's going to happen. I would rather be here than go down south. If that's,
Gavin,
the option is.
What would it mean to you? I mean, I didn't realise you'd only got this news last week. So thank you very much for coming here today when things...
Yes, cancer is a journey, isn't it? I'm not the only one with cancer. There's thousands of people with cancer.
So what would it mean to you to know that you had a choice of being able to control what might happen, at least have that choice?
Well, 3 close friends have died of cancer in my last 20 years. I witnessed them die from metastasized cancer. I learned then all about what happens at the end of life with a metastasized cancer. So it's, I learned all about that. It's a very humbling experience to watch people die. You have a great feeling of love and compassion and humility. I would like to have the same here with my friends. People are so incredibly kind and generous. You want to be ill in your own home, hopefully. One very good friend died recently at home with palliative care.
Yes.
It was a good death. It was everything that you would want. So it is possible to, if that's what I want. I guess that's what most people would like, is to die at home with their friends and their family.
And I'm pleased to hear you say that about palliative care, because from our point of view, we've always argued that palliative care and voluntary assisted dying, it's all the same conversation. It's all about end of life and what works best for you. And we certainly strongly support here and everywhere else greater funding for palliative care. Kelly, if I can ask you at the other end of the scale, so your dad fell ill, I think it was about 8 years after the laws were repealed, and or started to fall seriously ill. Can you talk me through motor neurone disease? Probably of all the diseases I've learnt about over the course of this 10 years, it will be the one I would least want to have to experience. Can you tell us something, and I apologise to any of your family if this is upsetting, about what those last months were like when your dad was keeping that diary?
Dad moved here in the 50s. He was a merchant navalist from England. Did a stint in Sydney and came up to Darwin and fell in love with the place. Everyone having barbecues in the back, playing guitar, the hula, and he connected with a lot of the Indigenous families. He married an Aboriginal woman up here and had 4 sons. And then they remarried and he met my mother. But watching Dad in these last few months, and I think that my brothers who are here with us tonight will attest, because the 2 that are here were the ones that were the most present along with myself. It was hell. It was horrible for Dad. He was a very fit man. He did marathons, triathlons. He taught gymnastics. He did spearfishing. He worked in the harbour as a tug master. He ran as much as he could, and we started to notice he was falling over a lot. He'd have falls. But fast forwarding to, he did gymnastic, diving, every sport you can think of. So to watch this man who was so used to playing sports and being so fit, not being able to have movement in his body, it was an awful thing. He deteriorated not only physically, just lost all the weight. His pride was terribly damaged. It was all about dignity for Dad, having to rely on everybody else to help him go to the bathroom or to feed him like a baby. I think it was one of the hardest things for him, not being able to talk and tell us that he loved us or thank us for doing the things that we did, because the way we eventually started communicating is we had an alphabet and he'd blink for a letter to sort of draft a message. So in his Facebook diary, like a lot of us would be helping him write these messages for him. We'd try and make him, as he'd lose different fingers, as the days went by, we sort of made him a bit of a stick to help him type, because he loved his computer so much. That became his lifeline. He would play things like Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, because she ran and was very active, and he had a bit of a fondness for that stuff.
And it's worth noting that motor neuron disease, your mental capacity is unimpaired.
Yep.
You're exactly the same person inside your head.
Lights are on. It's just everything stops working. So eventually he couldn't swallow. I remember they came out to do a check. I think a nutritionist came out to do a check, and she got a bit of a funny look on her face when she seen him in the lounge where we had him, and it's all a little bit of a blur, but the next thing I remember is that they were telling us that they wanted to give us a little bit of respite. He ended up in palliative, and about a week later, he was gone.
So were you able to be there when he went?
Yeah, we all were.
Yeah. And was Was it gentle at the end? Was it gentle at the end for him?
Morphine, fluids stopped.
Yeah.
I guess it wasn't.
The best
It wasn't
be
what
done.
he wanted.
No.
Let's say that it definitely wasn't what he wanted. I know, Dad. I hope my brother doesn't mind me telling this, but Dad had begged at least two of my brothers that I'm aware of to help him find some medicine to help him move stuff along. So.
And I've heard that so many times, and often it's more direct. Put a pillow over my face, do something else. It's a terrible situation, obviously, for your father, but for you as his kids. As you said, you've had 10 years to reflect on this. How would you describe the damage that witnessing your father's illness and death has left with you?
I think it's had an impact on all of us in different ways. I have my moments where I didn't think I was going to be able to do this tonight. Surprisingly enough, I'm okay at the moment. I'm not sure my brothers wanted to really speak. It took a really hard toll on them. I think a lot of the family as well that are here tonight who witnessed it with their own eyes. It's hard when you see a man that is so strong, so fit, so clever, so smart become what he became. And he was also in the Maritime Union as well. So he was he loved a good fight, a good argument. So he was like a dog with a bone. So the Facebook journey for him, the diary, was his way of, taking up the fight. So you just have to read it to see.
I think you can find it on the Go Gentle website. You can, but one of the last entries, you were having to type it out for him, obviously, at the end, but with capital letters was, "Damn you to hell, Kevin Andrews."
Yeah. I didn't like Kevin Andrews very much at the end.
I will have to say I'm so appreciative of you coming, all of you coming from the Bayliss family today, and this is exactly the bearing witness that I mean. This is what changes laws, and thank you. Duncan, yes, I think a round of applause. As the co-chair of that first committee, you had an opportunity to look around the territory and to hear from all kinds of voices. Just very quickly, first of all, would you say that there's support for the idea of assisted dying was strong or stronger than strong?
I would say overwhelming, other than occasional pockets of opposition, which were generally faith-based.
Mm-hmm. The two issues I hear most commonly raised, which are not, they're oppositional issues, but they're also genuine challenge issues, are Indigenous and cultural sensitivities and the overall state of the Northern Territory health system. I wonder, let's take the second one first. The sense I'm getting of the Northern Territory health system is that it's struggling and underfunded pretty much across the board in ways which I find quite worrying to look at. And so the argument is that, well, how can the Territory afford to bring in an entirely new service like assisted dying? You would have spoken to all the main players in this area. How problematic do you see that as being, and how addressable is it as a challenge?
Well, I think Territorians are very clear-eyed about the challenges that we live in, and as a result of being in the Northern Territory, and health service is one of them. Gavin's experience that he's just shared of the fact that he has to go to Adelaide for treatment. We're not talking about terminal cancer, but just health management. Often people have to leave the Territory to do that, and that means finding somewhere to stay, being away from family, all of those sorts of issues. What that does is it sort of creates a bit of a flintiness in people from the Northern Territory, that they accept that they won't necessarily get access to all of the best healthcare services. And so they don't accept that you have to have some sort of benchmark of of a quality or availability of healthcare service across the board before we can even consider something like voluntary assisted dying.
Yeah.
Their attitude is, we take the knocks, we take the disadvantage because we love the life here, and this is a right, and we expect it to be dealt with. We expect it.
And the sense I got reading some of the testimonies from health professionals is there's certainly an attitude here amongst our health services of health professionals understand, are up for, and are expected to wear a lot of hats. They might be specialists in more than one area. They're called on to do a number of things.
Absolutely. And I come from a medical family. My dad was a doctor, and they were working and living in places like Kununurra and Katherine, and they had to do everything and be everything for whatever walked through the door. So people expect that, and they're happy to deal with that. From the panel's perspective, we were, and we had medical professionals, including palcare professionals, on that panel, and we were very conscious of the fact that we were looking at a system that would have to be able to operate in that environment. And we knew that, for example, places like Katherine were having long periods of time with no GP except in the Aboriginal health services, which aren't available for non-Indigenous people. So the very basics that are elements of the voluntary assisted dying model aren't accessible if you don't have a GP who will do the first assessment, let alone the review assessment. And then you have the issues with the illegality of telehealth as part of voluntary assisted dying. So we were very, very aware of that, and a lot of our deliberations went into, well, how do you make a model work when that's the hand you've been dealt?
We're going to take questions from the audience very shortly. Duncan, just one other question about Aboriginal Territorians. There are a lot of cultural sensitivities around death and dying, and I know that they've been, both committees have looked closely into this area. What was your sense of the concerns and how deep they were amongst Aboriginal communities and remote communities about voluntary assisted dying?
I think I'd probably group them into three categories of response. The first was indifference, that it just simply was not of interest, and there was there was a lot of non-engagement. So we used a lot of channels to reach out and engage with the Indigenous community. And I was looking through the committee's second interim report today, and I saw that a number of the same channels have been used. So using bodies like AMSANT, the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance, to reach out to Indigenous communities to ensure that we did get that feedback. And so a distinct category of response was indifference. There was another category of response that was very much around, and this was the more traditional Aboriginal communities and individuals that we spoke to and areas that we went into, that when they were very much living a traditional lifestyle, it was really just simply, this isn't part of our way, this isn't our culture, it doesn't really fit in to what we, how our universe exists. This is basically a Bullanda system. You do whatever you want. It's not for us, and our law's been here for 40,000 years, and your law changes a lot. Was sort of some of the responses that we got.
Picky,
yeah. And then the third response was one which was essentially, I thought, along the same lines as the mainstream of the population, and that is to say that there is a significant proportion of the Indigenous population who support the law, who support the availability of the right to choose, and had no difficulty with the idea of legislation being brought in.
Thank you. Gavin, just quickly, I was saying before that what's needed for the law to change is for the community to engage. You've come here today despite your recent news. Is this, and you've already spoken to the NT News, is this an issue you intend to stay engaged in? As in, until a law passes, are you going to be on the front line?
Well, I can't believe that we're still here 30 years later talking about passing a law. They haven't got to the stage yet of passing a law. It seems to me as though what we're all doing here is asking for the law to be, just to be written up. I'm waiting for VAD to come into practice so that I'll have a choice. At the moment, there's no choice. I can only reaffirm what you've been saying, that community, it's people power that forces governments to do something.
Yeah.
This government, unbelievably, said that they weren't interested in passing this law.
In fairness, they said it wasn't a priority. I think
it wasn't a priority, but what does that mean? It's not a priority. Yes. I'm not interested. I mean, if you say it's not important or it's not a priority, Sue Shearer would say, well, it is important. It is a priority to us older people. We think about death. If you're thinking about dying, if you're older, you don't want a chief minister to just dismiss you saying it's not a priority.
Yes.
We are a priority. Older people live here. Older people used to leave Darwin and go down south. It's not like that anymore. People retire here now. We have a very good life here.
Yes.
We've got air conditioning now. It wasn't like that 50 years ago. People used to head off down south. But, now that we're living here and we enjoy a good life, and it is a good life in Darwin, I don't want to go and live anywhere else.
Yeah.
Every time I go somewhere else, it's not as nice as Darwin. So the law needs to be changed, it needs to be written up, and it needs to come into effect here as an urgency. Yeah.
Kelly, painful though it has been, and you've done beautifully. Is this a cause that you're prepared to stay front and is this a cause you're prepared to stay front and centre on, you and your family, because it is powerful?
Absolutely. I look at my original stand. It wasn't even a stance. It was just a selfish daughter. No, Dad, no, this is silly. What you're talking about. Logic kicks in. Looking at everything that he talked about, having time to sort of let the dust settle. It's absolutely it needs to be brought forward. People need just the right to choose for themselves. People shouldn't be choosing for others.
Well said. Thank you.